Could have been almost anything. A fourth grade art project or a business proposal. You mustered the courage to show something you worked really hard on to people you respect. This was your baby. And they told you they didn't like it. Something like that has happened to just about every one of us. It seems some people's reaction is to think that may really not have been very good. I can improve it. But some of us think they're right. I'm no good. That's shame. Or sometimes you really have done something wrong. When I was a reporter working the government beat in Columbus, Indiana, one of the other reporters was having trouble with our editor. They couldn't get along. He was on her back about her writing style in a way that wasn't helpful. She was looking for somebody to pass some of that anxiety on to, so she shot me a message on our inter-office email system about how rude he was being. And I sent back a terse reply, "I'm sorry he's being such a jerk, only I accidentally sent it to him." Well, he called me in his office and dressed me down loudly, and I felt horrible. It was wrong what I did, and not just because I sent it to him. It was right to feel guilty about it. But shame, it seems to me, is another thing altogether. Guilt isn't always a bad thing. Guilt says, I've done something wrong here, and sometimes that's true. Guilt can cause us to change course, to act, to make things better. Shame is almost never helpful, because shame is hearing criticism and agreeing and saying to myself, not I did a bad thing, but I am a bad person. As Burnette Brown defines it, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging, end quote. This morning I want to talk about getting past shame and moving on to living more courageously. I'm indebted to Burnette Brown, especially her book, Daring Greatly, for parts of this sermon. Brown, you may know, is a research professor at the University of Houston who travels the country talking about shame and its effects. She calls herself a shame researcher. And often in parentheses she puts, I know, I thought that too. Her end goal is to have people live what she calls wholehearted lives. Here's how she defines wholehearted living. It's about engaging in our lives from a place of worthiness. It means cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up in the morning and think, no matter what gets done or how much is left undone, I am enough. It's going to bed at night thinking, yes, I'm imperfect and vulnerable and sometimes afraid, but that doesn't change the truth that I'm also brave and worthy of love and belonging. Brown encourages people to spend their lives daring greatly. Maybe you recognize that language. It comes from a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. It's a paragraph. He said, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." End quote. I don't know what he was trying to get people to do there, but I want to do it now. We'll get back to shame in a minute, but it's important first to say that the world needs people who are not afraid to dare greatly. And your family needs people who are not afraid to dare greatly. And this congregation needs members and friends who are not afraid to dare greatly. Because the world is filled with perplexing questions. How will we sustain social security? How will the United States move toward wholeness around race and ethnicity? How does a congregation grow in 21st century America? Should I work to save this relationship, or is it time to move on? How do I help my child whose grades are suffering succeed in school? Creative solutions to problems, big problems like those, require the willingness to try a new thing that may or may not work. They require us, as Theodore Roosevelt said, to dare greatly, to be willing, to be vulnerable enough to stand before the world with a new idea. There is, of course, a danger in daring greatly. It requires that we find the courage to be vulnerable. An illustration from the business world. Do you remember the launch of the iPad? It's kind of seared into my memory. What a ridiculous idea. Apple ratcheted up megatons of suspense about the launch of this product. A labor-saving electronic device on the scale of like the first electric toaster or something like that. And then Steve Jobs walked out onto the stage with something that looked like a giant clown cell phone that you can't talk on. Who was going to buy this thing? The answer, of course, is pretty much everybody. I'm intrigued by things like that. How did Steve Jobs get through all the failed models of his products, maybe especially the first products of his company? All the versions that didn't work, to the one that I'm preaching from this morning. You know, there were 1,000 people screaming at him from the bleachers, "That's never going to work. You'll never get to launch. No one is going to buy that thing." I have to say I was one of those people. But for Steve Jobs, as for Roosevelt, it wasn't the critic who counted. Still, contrary to Teddy Roosevelt's famous quote, for many of us, it is the critic who counts. Ministers are surely among the worst offenders here. We love you all. We love the people we serve, and so we want to make you happy. A lot of us, truth is, are people pleasers from way back. I was once in a minister's meeting when the pastor of a large church said, imagine you're greeting people as they leave the sanctuary. 100 people tell you you preached a great sermon, and one person walks by and tells you that sermon was the worst I've ever heard. Whose input will you spend more time on? I know the story I would be telling my wife that evening. I know that approval-seeking ministers are not alone. So many of us rely on the feedback of other people in our lives to know whether or not we're doing a good job. Some of us become so fearful of negative feedback that we become hesitant to share because our self-worth is attached to what the people in the bleachers think about my idea. Because what will they say? What will they say about our parenting? About my art? Brene Brown sums it up. Because of how you were raised or how you approach the world, you've knowingly or unknowingly attached your self-worth to how your product or art is received. In simple terms, if they love it, you're worthy. If they don't love it, you're worthless. In the limited amount of counseling I've done over the last 15 years of ministry, I've come across some themes. One of them is that many of us internalize other people's opinions of us or of something we've created, and we make them our own opinions of ourselves. That leads to people-pleasing, and we chase down approval, and approval becomes as addictive as any drug. In that approval-addicted state, we're no longer living from a strong center that's rooted in our own values and beliefs. We've handed over our lives to people who may not even have our best in mind. That's where shame takes a person. And our scarcity culture feeds the cycle. In her workshop, Brene Brown asks people, fill in the blank, never blank enough. Some common answers that she's received: never good enough, never perfect enough, never thin, powerful, successful, smart enough, never certain enough, never extraordinary enough. Scarcity, always clawing just a little further until we're really satisfied. Brown writes, shame hangs out in the parking lot of the arena, waiting for you to come out defeated and determined never to take risks. It laughs and says, I told you this was a mistake. I knew you weren't blank enough. And she continues, shame resilience is the ability to say, this hurts, this is disappointing, maybe even devastating, but success and recognition and approval are not the values that drive me. My value is courage, and I was just courageous. You can move on, shame. End quote. If I could only preach one sermon for the rest of my life, it would be centered on this idea. You are enough. Not some future version of yourself, thinner and richer with kids who are valedictorian at the best college in the country. You, right now, with all your flaws and quirks. You know, that's an important message of universalism, that in God's sight we are all beloved, that every person has inherent worth and dignity, not earned by career or status or home or car or family. Inherent. Even me. Even you. There will be people who don't treat us that way. But as Brown said, nothing has transformed my life more than realizing that it's a waste of time to evaluate my worthiness by weighing the reaction of the people in the stands. The people who love me will be there regardless of the outcome, and they're within arm's reach. These, the people who have stood by us over time, are the people to whom we can reach out when we feel shame. We can trust them with our stories, trust them not to judge, but be companions on our journeys. Maybe your life is centered on shame. Maybe because of messages that still play in your mind from the way you were raised, or maybe because you've taken on too much of our culture's message of scarcity, or who knows. If you're a shame-based person like a lot of us are, there are things that you can do. Brene Brown recommends a few of them, but I want to add one to her list. I think the first important thing to do is to know who we are. When all your energy is just fuel to drive you to your next hit of approval from somebody else, it's easy to lose yourself, to forget what your values are. Who are you? Brown says, what we know matters, but who we are matters more. Do we know who that is? The second thing recommended by Brown, recognize shame and when you're in the grips of it. Read about it if it helps. I recommend Brown's work. It's very good. And third, and importantly, reach out. Shame, Brown says, derives its power from being unspeakable. So speak it. When you feel ashamed, find a trusted friend or a professional to share your story with. Don't keep it all to yourself. There's a lot more to say about shame. Let me conclude by saying that on April 12th, Peter Morales, the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, will be here. He's preaching a sermon entitled Fail Often. He's going to talk about the fact that our rapidly changing culture requires congregations to become comfortable with trying new ideas, some of which will fail. In other words, to succeed in the 21st century, we need to create an atmosphere in which failure isn't just okay, it's expected. We'll have to dare greatly. But that isn't just true in organized religion. It's true in life in general. The world needs us to have the courage to be vulnerable, to show up 100% to our families, our jobs, and to the biggest problems of our time. Friends, remember, you are enough. Enough, just as you are, not tomorrow or a year from now. You are enough and you are loved. Amen.